On September 20, 1967, the building housing the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and the U.S. Court of Federal Claims was dedicated. Now known as the Howard T. Markey National Courts Building, it was constructed as part of a major 1960s renovation of the square. In the early 1800s, the President's house was sited in a large park. President Thomas Jefferson's decision to form the 7-acre Lafayette Square by cutting Pennsylvania Avenue through the President's Park led to residential home construction on the park's east and west sides. The courts complex today includes the Dolly Madison House, built in 1820, and the Tayloe House, built in 1828. Other homes would be erected on lots on Madison Place during the 19th century. All of the homes housed or entertained some of the most prominent individuals in American cultural and political history. A large group of invited guests gathered on Madison Place in September 1967 for the dedication of the new National Courts building. The two court occupants of the new building, the U.S. Court of Claims and the U.S. Court of Customs and Patent Appeals, CCPA, were represented on the dais. Among the honored guests were Supreme Court justices and individuals involved in the project, including Court of Claims Senior Judge Marvin Jones, who is typically credited as the driving force for the new courts building. By mid-19th century, the streets bounding Lafayette Square include Madison Place and residences owned or rented by prominent figures. Two of the earliest buildings on Lafayette Square were St. John's Church on H Street and the Cutts House, later the Cutts Madison House, and now the Dolly Madison House. The White House is situated on the south side of Lafayette Square, opposite St. John's Church. Dolly Madison, born Dolly Payne in North Carolina in 1768, married James Madison in 1794 in Philadelphia. At the time, James Madison served as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Dolly's first husband, John Todd, a Philadelphia lawyer, had died the year before, along with one of their two sons, in a yellow fever epidemic. For a few years, the Madisons lived at his Virginia plantation, Montpelier. From 1801, when Madison began as Secretary of State under President Thomas Jefferson, through his own presidency, they resided in Washington, D.C. During these years, the gracious and vivacious Dolly Madison develops her role as First Lady. After James Madison's term as president, they retire to Montpelier. But after James dies, Dolly eventually sells Montpelier and moves permanently to Washington. She lived in the Cutts House on Lafayette Square from 1844 until her death in 1849. Richard Cutts, a former congressman and government official in the Madison administration, was married to Anna Payne, Dolly Madison's sister. Richard built the house in 1820 on one of the 3 lots he had purchased along the future Madison Place. In 1828, when Cutts fell into debt, James Madison bailed him out by buying the property and allowing the Cutts family to remain in the house as renters. Anna died in 1832. Dolly Madison frequently hosted visitors and held memorable parties at her D.C. home. She received numerous invitations from prominent Washingtonians as well. On February 7, 1849, just 5 months before suffering a fatal stroke, Dolly attended a party given in her honor by then-President James Polk. Few First Ladies since Dolly Madison have had a comparable impact on the nation's capital. In 1851, Charles Wilkes acquired the Cutts Madison House from Dolly's heirs. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy, explorer for the government, and somewhat controversial, having made his reputation as both a war hero and the instigator of the San Jacinto affair that nearly brought the United Kingdom into the U.S. Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. Rear Admiral Wilkes extensively remodeled the home and improved the grounds that were part of the purchased property. During the Civil War, Wilkes offered his home for government use. For several months in 1861, as commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, General George B. McClellan set up headquarters in the house and held meetings there, including with President Lincoln and some of the president's cabinet members. In 1887, the Wilkes family sold the house to the Cosmos Club, a private social club established in 1878 as a gathering place for those interested in the natural, physical, and social sciences. The Cosmos Club thus continued the Dolly Madison House tradition of hosting the intellectual and cultural elite of Washington, D.C. The federal government purchased all of the club property in 1940, renting the space back to the club until 1952. In 1957, the dramatic launch of the first unmanned spacecraft, Sputnik, by the Soviet Union triggered a space race that led to the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA took the Madison Place buildings as its headquarters. In 1959, the first astronauts, who would make history in space during the following decade, gathered at the Dolly Madison House to show a model of the Mercury capsule built for American manned space travel. In 1992, the historic building became available for use by the Federal Circuit, and it has been part of the courts complex ever since. The Taylor family of Virginia early on purchased 3 lots on the east side of Lafayette Square at the urging of their friend, George Washington. Washington sought investment in what was to become the capital city. One of the Taylor's sons, Benjamin Ogle, inherited the property. In 1928, he built an elegant house that would become 21 Madison Place. Taylor had wealth, social and political connections, and received a Harvard education. He studied law with the U.S. Attorney General Richard Rush, his father's longtime friend. When President James Monroe appointed Rush minister to England, Taylor traveled to Europe as part of Rush's delegation. He returned to America in 1819, purchased an estate on the Potomac River in Virginia, and became a country gentleman. In 1824, Taylor married Julia Dickinson, the daughter of a New York congressman. Although they lived at the Virginia estate for several years, Julia preferred the more active urban lifestyle, and they eventually moved into the Madison Place home. It became a gathering place for the social and political elite of Washington, D.C. during the mid-19th century and through the Civil War. In 1887, the property passed into the hands of heirs of the Taylors and eventually was purchased by Senator J. Donald Cameron of Pennsylvania. Cameron had served as Secretary of War under President Ulysses S. Grant. He was well known in Washington circles, particularly among the high-stakes poker crowd, whom he hosted in games at the Taylor House until the end of his Senate term in 1897. At that time, he returned to Pennsylvania and rented out the house. A plaque at the Taylor House memorializes the numerous luminaries who used the house as their base of operations in Washington. Cameron's first lessee was the Vice President of the United States, Garrett A. Hobart. The Hobarts frequently held dinners at the Taylor House where President William McKinley would meet with other political figures. After Hobart died in 1899, Marcus Hanna, McKinley's political strategist and advisor, rented the home. McKinley's visits are so frequent during his presidency that the Taylor House is known as the Little White House. Just before the Cosmos Club acquires the Taylor House, it is occupied by the National Woman's Party, which advocates for women's right to vote. Alice Paul, a leader among the suffragists, leads marches from the Taylor House to Capitol Hill during this period from 1915 to 1917. Women finally achieve equal voting rights in 1920. The Cosmos Club used the Taylor House as a ladies' annex, with meeting and residential space, a kitchen and dining room, and a garden area that served as an eating place in good weather. When the court building was planned, the Taylor House was to become part of the new complex. It would provide dining and lounging facilities. The former garden of the Taylor House remains a space of beauty and serenity as part of the courtyard between the house and the court's building. Although the circumstances of his purchase are not entirely clear, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky owned the lot on the south side of Taylor House. In 1827, Commodore John Rodgers, a celebrated naval commander, acquired the lot. The story goes that Rodgers brought back some especially fine jackasses from Turkey following a diplomatic mission. Clay had a keen interest in obtaining such an animal for breeding on his Kentucky farm, but Rodgers refused to sell the animal for cash. Instead, he made an offer that Clay accepted. Clay's Madison Place lot for Rogers' Jackass. Rogers built a magnificent 30-room, 3-story home on the property. Most of the time, however, the house was rented out. At one point, it served as one of the finer, more exclusive boarding houses, and over the years, cabinet members, members of Congress, and other high government officials rented rooms here. In 1858, a private social club, the Washington Club, rented the building. But the club lost members as many Southerners returned to their home states during the Civil War, and it ultimately closed. Even before the war, however, the Washington Club's reputation had taken a heavy blow when a love triangle involving two of its members, Daniel Sickles, a New York congressman, and Philip Barton Key, a United States attorney, resulted in Key's death. Sickles discovered that his wife, Teresa, was having an affair with Key, the son of Francis Scott Key, and known as a ladies' man. On February 27, 1859, Sickles caught up with Key outside the Rogers house. Screaming, "You must die!" Sickles shot Key in the chest. Key was taken into the Rogers house, where the coroner held his inquest. Although tried for murder, Sickles successfully pled not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The jury ultimately sympathized with Sickles over Key's violation of Sickles' honor and Teresa's unfaithfulness, even though evidence at the trial showed that Sickles himself had a mistress. With the departure of the Washington Club, the Rogers house reverted to a private residence with its new occupants. William H. Seward, Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration, and his family. The Seward home became a site of many official dinner parties, less formal receptions, and meetings throughout the Civil War. Although they started out at arm's length and distrustful of one another, Lincoln and Seward became close friends as they worked together during this difficult period. Lincoln would also frequently take Seward's wife and daughter for afternoon rides, developing a warm friendship with them as well. In April 1865, as the Civil War drew to its end at Appomattox, Virginia, Seward suffered a severe injury in a carriage accident. President Lincoln would visit him as he lay on his sickbed at the Madison Place home. Unbeknownst to them, conspirators are making plans for their assassination. Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, and Seward by Lewis Payne, a Confederate Army deserter. On April 13, 1865, while casing Seward's home, Payne audaciously approaches a male nurse having breakfast by the window of the house and asks about Seward's health following the carriage accident. Payne attempts to murder Seward the following night. He barges into the Rogers house, makes his way to Seward's bedroom, fighting off attempts to stop him, and slashes the secretary with a knife. Payne flees. Saved by the brace he was wearing as a result of his earlier accident, Seward eventually recovers. He remains Secretary of State and famously negotiates the purchase of Alaska in 1867. James G. Blaine, Secretary of State under President Benjamin Harrison, leases the Rogers house from 1889 through the election of 1892, when he resigns. After returning to Madison Place following months of travel abroad, Blaine suddenly becomes ill and dies in January 1893. He is the last to rent the house. Soon after his death, a group from Chicago buys the house and demolishes the Rogers house to erect a new and completely different structure, the Lafayette Square Opera House. In about 1831, a prominent dentist, Dr. James A. Gunnell, built a house on the southernmost property on Madison Place at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue. During the Civil War, the government used the Gunnell House primarily as the headquarters for the commanding general of the city of Washington. President Buchanan's Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, second from left in this photograph, owned the house at the time of the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War. In 1861, the government seized the property. The Lafayette Square Opera House, where the Rogers House had stood, opened on September 20, 1895. Although Madison Place had seen many entertaining evenings in the private homes on the block, the Opera House brought a new vibe to the street and to the Lafayette Square area. In 1904, producers David Belasco and the Schubert brothers purchased the Opera House and renamed it the Belasco Theater. Prominent theatergoers, including American presidents, enjoy shows starring some of the most popular performers of the day. During World War II, the theater becomes the National Stage Door Canteen, an entertainment center for members of the armed forces. Local theater star Helen Hayes spoke at the canteen's inaugural event. Hayes was a fitting presence there. She had gotten her start at the Belasco Theater in 1909 at the age of 9. Recognizing a long-standing need for a new home for the Court of Claims, President Eisenhower signed a bill that provided funds for the design of a court building on the east side of Lafayette Square. By then, the federal government owned all of the property on Madison Place. Eisenhower called it a special opportunity to revive the historical and architectural significance of the square. The Boston architects that had been retained, however, offered a contemporary courthouse design that would replace the historic Madison Place homes. In 1961, John F. Kennedy assumes the presidency. He and First Lady Jackie Kennedy strongly hold the view that any restoration must preserve the traditional atmosphere of Lafayette Square. In April of 1962, the president asks San Francisco architect John Carl Wernicke to provide input on the project. Among other suggestions for Lafayette Square, Wernicke proposes demolishing the Belasco Theater, but preserving the Madison and Taylor houses to provide a facade for the new court building. Jackie Kennedy pushes hard for adoption of Wernicke's approach. Reaction is split, however. Some involved in the decision agree with the Kennedy-Wernicke concept, while others argue for a new, contemporary look to the square. Ultimately, though, the Kennedys prevailed, and in July 1962, the General Services Administration, GSA, replaced the Boston architects with Carl Wernicke's firm. In October of that year, Wernicke unveils his ideas for Madison Place at a press conference to the satisfaction of the President and Mrs. Kennedy. Construction of Wernicke's design begins in 1964. Although the Court of Claims is the intended occupant from the start, the new building comes to be the home of the U.S. Court of Customs and Patent Appeals as well. In 1960, the CCPA judges, led by Chief Judge Eugene Worley, meet with Court of Claims Chief Judge Marvin Jones and discuss the idea of sharing the new courthouse. Jones agrees. The two courts collaborate with each other and with the General Services Administration on the interior layouts and arrangements for the building. George Hutchinson, clerk of the CCPA, was a member of the team working on the new court's building. He would later reflect that they accomplished everything we needed, because the team was involved from the beginning and worked daily with GSA, participating in all of the decisions that affected the operation of the courts. After considering various problems at the federal appellate level, Congress decided to create a new Court of Appeals with national jurisdiction. Combining the CCPA and Court of Claims, two existing courts already housed in the same building, made the prospective Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit an efficient choice. On April 2, 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the act creating the Federal Circuit and the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. CCPA Chief Judge Howard T. Markey was chosen the Federal Circuit's first Chief Judge. He has been recognized as an exceptional leader, both in his years as Chief Judge at the CCPA and especially on the Federal Circuit. Honoring his contributions, the courthouse was renamed the Howard T. Markey National Courts Building in a special Federal Circuit Court of Federal Claims joint session on October 23, 1998. Judge Giles S. Rich spoke at the rededication of the building in 1998 as he had at the original dedication in 1967. He was able to look back over those 31 years with satisfaction that the courts had indeed performed their duties well. Having been with Markey since 1972, when Markey arrived at the CCPA as Chief Judge, Judge Rich could attest that the perpetuation of the name Howard T. Markey by attachment to this building is well deserved. The courts complex is not just a piece of our federal judiciary, but a part of the story of the United States and the historical development of our capital city. Happy 50th birthday to the Howard T. Markey National Courts Building, and best wishes for many more years of service to our nation.